Alrighty, friends, welcome back to History with Tim, Historian Rankings. So we're going to continue our U.S. President ranking today. I finished it with James Buchanan on Sunday. So we're going to start today with Abraham Lincoln. Now again, like I said last time, we're going to do it up until the 39th president. That will be James Carter. I will not be doing Ronald Reagan. I will not be doing George H.W. Bush. I will not be doing Bill Clinton, George W., Barack Obama, Donald J. Trump, or Joe Biden. I will not be doing any of them. I will only do from Washington to Carter. That's just, I don't want to deal with any politics. It's just easier that way. I had a long day at work. So, I'm going to go through this. We are going to be respectful. I don't care what your political beliefs are. I don't care. This is a history video. And again, it's my opinion. You are more than free to disagree with me. And I highly suggest you do. That's honestly, not to sound like Michael Scott in that one episode of The Office, but that's what makes America great, is that you could tell me I'm wrong, and then you could tell me who you think is the best president. But with that said, please like, share, and comment. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe. Let's get into it. 2, 1. Okay, so when we last waited off, we did James Buchanan, old buck. So now we're going to start with none other than Abraham Lincoln. That's right, Abe Lincoln. All right, so Abe Lincoln, as we know, 16th President of the United States. He's from Kentucky, becomes very accomplished in Illinois as a lawyer, rises up the ranks. He actually campaigned. Back, it used to not be the way it is today. The president didn't openly campaign. People would campaign for the president. So Lincoln actually was the upset candidate. No one expected him to be the Republican candidate. He ended up being the first Republican president, serving from 1861 to 1865. He will be killed he will be killed a year into his second term, unfortunately, by John Wilkes Booth. Oh my God, what was the name of the organization? Knights of the Cross or something like that. Someone please comment what the name of the organization was. Now, of course, we look at Lincoln and we look at what he did during the American Civil War. Now, the American Civil War is fought from 1861 to 1865. Unfortunately, Lincoln lives and dies in his presidency with the American Civil War. I'm actually today wearing my Army of the Potomac athletics shirt. I thought it'd be fun to wear. I don't actually have any presidential merch, which I don't know why I would. But, so he is, he, at the beginning of the war, is kind of micromanaging, and then he thinks he did a mistake. Then he lets George B. McClellan run the war. Then he notices, okay, I gave this guy a little too much freedom. And then he puts Burnside on a leash, and a lot of people say that is what caused the catastrophe at Fredericksburg, because Burnside did not have the flexibility of someone like George B. McClellan. It's after Burnside, Lincoln finally makes a decision to back off. He allows Hooker to lead the army at Chancellorsville. He also starts noticing a very accomplished general in the West named Ulysses S. Grant. There's cries for him to have Grant resign, but he says, I cannot lose this man. He fights. Another famous quote about Lincoln about Grant was someone told him he was drunk at the Battle of Shiloh, and Lincoln said, find out what kind of whiskey he drinks so I can get to all my generals. Lincoln will also, in 1863, set the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, this is where I'm going to be a little harsh, because there's this thing called Juneteenth in the United States. That is the day the last Confederate Army surrendered to federal forces in Texas. For a very long time, it has been misrepresented. They've made it that it was Juneteenth is the day the Emancipation Proclamation made it to that territory. The Emancipation Proclamation literally did nothing against slavery. So let me explain. So the Emancipation Proclamation was a war measure. What a war measure is a war measure is the president can make certain decrees without consulting Congress. The Emancipation Proclamation was a world war measure, and it only affected states in rebellion. So that means states like Maryland, Delaware, I believe Tennessee, West Virginia. They did not have to hand over their slaves. Their slaves could stay in bondage. But Lincoln, along with Republicans in Congress, worked until he pretty much got killed to get the 13th Amendment passed, which does abolish slavery. So when you're Juneteenth, which should be it's coming up, I think, this week, actually. I think it's this week. Remember, that's not the day the Emancipation Proclamation made it to Texas. That's the day the 13th Amendment made it to Texas. And I believe it only took 4 Confederate states to ratify the amendment for it to get passed. So, that's all great things Lincoln did. Lincoln, he held the country together. However, and this is, Lincoln growing up, Lincoln used to be one of my favorite presidents. The more I've come to learn of Lincoln, the more he's become a very great character to me. Lincoln suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Now, that is one of the most central to freedom of speech in this country. Pretty much he threatened to throw people in prison that were against the war. He pretty much made men like Dan Sickles generals just to keep the war, keep the Democrats from being against the war. He definitely has changed in my eyes over the years. Still probably one of our best presidents. No one else, God knows no one else would be able to handle what he handled. But because of the abuses, which again, it's war measures, is what it is, I'm going to put him at A. Not going to put him at S tier. I don't believe he would be. His successor, Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was elected as the Union Party. He was actually a Democrat. Lincoln was a Republican. His first term, his vice president was Hannibal Hamlin. In the second term, his vice president was Andrew Johnson, a Unity Party. Johnson, however, would botch Reconstruction completely. I'm actually going to put him at D. He probably he enforced a lot of things that pushed back civil rights for African Americans. He also tried to have the Secretary of War replaced with Ulysses S. Grant. Congress had made that illegal. He's the first president to be impeached by Congress. He did not get removed from office, obviously. He would serve from 1865 to 1869, pretty much just finishing off Lincoln's term. Now, here's one that I think I will get a lot of argument about. Ulysses S. Grant. I'm going to put him at B-. Grant was huge to civil rights. Grant was the one, he ran as a Republican, he won unanimously. He resigned from the Army to become president. He named William T. Sherman the new commander of the armies, and after Sherman, Philip Sheridan would be. But Grant, I think a lot of the corruption from his cabinet and the people he assigned overshadow his true what he really did. He's one of the first people to look towards veteran affairs, with the Grand Army of the Republic organization, which was Union soldiers who would, it was pretty much like a modern day VA. Union soldiers would pool money together to help one another out for those who were on hard times. Many generals and regular soldiers and navymen and anyone who fought for the North in the war was a member of the GAR. He also pushed for civil rights. He was prepared to start a second civil war. He made the Department of Justice. That is what took out the KKK and all the other white supremacist groups. He was the first one to do that. They would make a resurface in the early 1900s, and we're going to get to that because this video I do plan to talk about that person. But Grant, I think, is a B tier. I think he was very misunderstood. I think his biggest fault was he looked at government like the military. In the military, you give your orders and you follow them. Politics, there is no rules. There's rules to war. There's no rules to politics. Alrighty, Rutherford B. Hayes. Hayes, another Ohio guy. Grant and Hayes are both from Ohio. Hayes was a very controversial pick. Hayes was actually, the song "The Room Where It Happens" in Hamilton kind of explains. No one had enough electoral votes in the election. Hayes is a Republican, but pretty much Southern Democrats in Congress said, if you agree to end Reconstruction, we will approve of you being president of the United States. It went to a contingent election, I believe. That's when the House decides who the president is, not the Electoral College. So Hayes agreed if they made him president, he would end Reconstruction. And he did. Which could be point of contention. That's when Jim Crow really starts coming out after the fall of the Reconstruction regime. But to be honest, the whole thing about Reconstruction was it was doing more to divide the country at this point. And unfortunately, it is in the wake of the fall of Reconstruction that you see the lost cause myth start rising, because it is after Hayes, Grant will die, a bunch of these older generals will die, they won't be able to defend themselves any longer, and you will see the creation of the famous lost cause myth. That is the idea that it was about states' rights and nothing else. Hayes, I'm going to put at C+. I don't think he was a bad president. I think, when you're working in a situation like the post-Civil War America, you do your best. And that's where we're going to go with that. Garfield. Garfield's an upsetting one. He's another Ohio guy. Garfield will be president 1881. Yeah, 1881. So, he was a very big advocate of the civil service reform and agriculture reform. He also, he wanted to get rid of the spoil system. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. Quid pro quos, if you will. Unfortunately, stalwart Republicans were not in favor of that. And among the stalwarts was a very mentally ill man named Charles Guiteau. Guiteau wanted to be the ambassador to the Austrian Empire. Then he said, okay, I'll settle for France. Garfield's Secretary of State called him mad as a hatter. And this is actually a little crazy fact. Robert Todd Lincoln was meeting Garfield. Robert Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's eldest son. He went to politics after his father's death. Robert Todd Lincoln would actually be at 3 presidential assassinations, I think. He was at the aftermath of his father. He was meeting Garfield at the train station. And then he will be at the Great American Exposition in Buffalo for McKinley. I think it was after that he said, I never want to be around a president again, because he thought he was the one causing them. But that's a crazy little thing. We really don't know how Garfield would be. He was considered a very honorable man. He was a member of the GAR. He fought in the Civil War as well. We're going to have a lot of guys here who fought in the Civil War. I believe McKinley will be the last Civil War president. And by Civil War president, I mean someone who served in the Civil War. So I'm going to put him also, I'm going to put him at a B, because his record before becoming president was a very accomplished one, and he was a very popular man, especially considering, as I said before, Hayes had to win on a contingent election. The fact that Garfield, in a time that the Democrats were making a comeback, the fact that he won and was so popular says a lot. Chester A. Arthur, he is actually he was not elected. He will serve from 1881 to 1885. He was Garfield's vice president. He was a stalwart. He was a spoil system Republican. Ironically, though, he would be the one that passes the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act, which kind of brought an end to the spoil system. He also was the governor of New York and was kind of considered a very corrupt governor. I'm gonna put him at C minus just because the Pendleton Civil Service Act, that's good and all. Still no. Chester A. Arthur, another. Actually, no, not Chester A. Arthur. Wow, that's embarrassing. Grover Cleveland, I believe Grover Cleveland is a Republican. Grover Cleveland is also the only president. Oh no, Grover Cleveland's the first Democratic president after the Civil War. Grover Cleveland is also the first president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. We haven't had one since. Whatever happens with this next election, who knows? But he is the only president as of now who will have served 2 terms back to back. He was known for honesty, very opposed to political corruption, and he advocated for lower tariffs. Now that's kind of dangerous because tariffs is kind of what paid the federal government up until Woodrow Wilson, when the income tax was created. So, but he also would be the one in his second term that the 1893 economic panic would occur. So I'm going to put him with Hayes right here. Benjamin Harrison, another one-termer, 1889 to 1893. He strengthened the U.S. Navy and U.S. influence around the world. He signed the Sherman Antitrust Act, which would be the first step in taking on these these multinational corporations, the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, people like that. I believe Benjamin Harrison was also, I believe he was a Republican. Don't quote me on that. Give me 1 second. He will also lose his reelection to Chester A. Arthur. Yeah, he was a Republican. And another person who served in the American Civil War. He would reverse a lot of Cleveland's policies. He would increase tariffs and federal spending, which is ironic of a Republican by today's standards. He was also related to William Henry Harrison. So I'm going to put him here. Because he's what you could say the beginning of the American imperial era. But who people would consider the real star of the American imperial era, William McKinley. He will be our 3rd president assassinated. So it's going to be Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley. There'll be an attempt on Theodore Roosevelt and Franklin D. Roosevelt. And then, of course, JFK. So William McKinley, he brought the United States into the Spanish-American War. Technically, we did not conquer those territories. They became independent protectorates. Puerto Rico, to this day, is still a protectorate of the United States. Other countries that were involved were Philippines, Guam, and Cuba. Obviously, those 3. Guam, I believe, we still control, because I think it's called U.S. Guam. But Philippines is an independent nation now, and so is Cuba. Obviously, Cuba has its own mess going on there. He also promoted the Gold Standard Act. He brought back the good times, so to speak. The Gilded Age. When you think the Gilded Age, you think McKinley. That's where it started. He, however, was an imperialist, and it was very controversial, especially when you're trying to purvey that we are the beacon of liberty and freedom. I'm actually gonna be honest. I'm gonna put him at B. I think he strengthened the country. I think he did a great job for what he's walking in after everything that happened with Cleveland and Harrison, and I think he did a great job. Now I'm just gonna do this. Yes, I stand by what I'm doing. Theodore Roosevelt was probably one of, if not our best U.S. presidents. He was a rich person, actually. His family, New York City Museum of Natural History, is actually his family's museum. They paid for it. However, Theodore, TR as he liked being called, he did not like being called Teddy. He found it quite insulting, actually. He believed in conservatism. When I say conservatism, I mean national conservatism. Like, he liked to protect the environment. He ended logging. He founded many, many national parks around the country, including Yosemite, I believe, or Yellowstone. He fought with the Rough Riders. He was the Undersecretary of the Navy. He pretty much came into office. He is also the youngest president. He is the youngest president we ever had. He was actually chosen to be McKinley's vice president as a way to keep him quiet. He'll be president from 1901 to 1909. He will win re-election. He was very much it's ironic because his famous quote is, "Speak soft but carry a big stick." He also created the bully pit, which pretty much he used his strength as the president to help push forward legislation and things. Created the Panama Canal, which, on some level could be seen as a imperialistic move. He is also awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for ending the Russo-Japanese War. Theodore Roosevelt was probably one of our best presidents, and he was very much he was a wild card, which made Europe slightly afraid of him. But also at the same time, he was a guy that he'll tell you how it is, and he's not about the politicking. Like, he politicked, of course. There's a famous story. One of the donors reached out to him, and they said, "Hey, we made you president. You said you would listen to us." And he's like, "And I am listening to you. I'm just not doing what you told me to do." So I always enjoy that. He's one of my favorites. He was a progressive reforms, trust busting. He brought an end to the monopolies. J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller. He finally put the nail in the Vanderbilt coffin, which is ironic because he grew up near the Vanderbilts. His family were wealthy philanthropists in New York City, and so were the Vanderbilts. He was a Republican, GOP. It's going to be confusing because his cousin, who also married his niece, yeah, it's confusing. He was a Democrat, but he also served as Undersecretary of the Navy. William Howard Taft. Taft is a return for the Republicans because Taft ran on Theodore Roosevelt's coattails. Pretty much, look how good the times I made were. This is my successor. William Howard Taft was his successor. He'd served from 1909 to 1913, sadly only one term. He continued some of Roosevelt's policies, but he didn't continue the important ones, which alienated the progressives, kind of split the Republican Party in half. I'm going to put him here at C-. He's also the only U.S. president who later became Supreme Court Justice of the United States Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. This one. Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson won because Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson would be 1913 to 1921. Roosevelt would run in the election in 1912 against Taft because he believed Taft was not accomplishing what he had laid out for him to accomplish. So this will be the first time a president will be proactively running for a third term. By doing so, he split the Republican Party in half. And, as crazy as it is to say today with demographics and polls and everything, the Republican Party was the popular party in the early 1900s. That was the party everyone was a part of. But by doing so, Woodrow Wilson will be elected. Now, before I said how Grover Cleveland will be the first Democrat after the Civil War, Woodrow Wilson is the governor of New Jersey, but he's the first Southern Democrat. He's from Virginia. He moves, he's kind of a reverse carpetbagger. He moves to New Jersey and becomes the governor of New Jersey, runs and wins the presidency. Wilson will be the one who enacted income tax. You all just figured out what my party is probably by that. He created income tax. He also would have the first movie filmed in the first movie aired in the White House. It will be called Birth of a Nation. Unfortunately, during Woodrow Wilson's term, you will see a very large growth in segregation. Jim Crow will become the rule, not the exception in the South. And also, the KKK will reappear. The KKK of today is rooted in this reappearance in the early 1900s. He will enter into World War One. He will propose the League of Nations, which will happen, but the United States, we will not join because we didn't want to. And also, he would be the only one at Versailles who would warn about punishing Germany so brutally. And, if only they had listened. Now, a lot of times when I do this, I weigh the differences, and I go, okay, maybe this, maybe this. No. Wilson goes right up. I will do an olive branch. D+. It's crazy because some people consider him the greatest president, one of the greatest presidents, and I just don't get it, to be completely honest. But he'll serve from 1913 to 1921. And also, fun fact, his wife, Edith Wilson, was pretty much the president for the last 2 years. He had suffered a stroke while he was touring the country trying to promote the League of Nations to the people. And pretty much everything that came to his office went through his wife first. So pretty much cabinet members will come to the door and be like, we need the president to sign this. She'd be like, okay, take the papers, close the door. He'd be in his bedroom. She'd walk into the Oval Office, sign it, and then hand it back. So I like to say Edith Wilson was the first female president. Warren G. Harding. He made the Roaring Twenties. He promoted growth. He made the United States what it was soon becoming an industrial power. Had a lot of scandal, though. He was he very much like Grant. His administration was full of scandal. So I will leave him at a C-. Calvin Coolidge. Now, Quiet Cal, as he was known. Coolidge was very to himself. He was a very quiet man. He only served from 1923 to 1929. It's only 4 years. He only did one term. He was very quiet. There's actually a story about him at at a party where a woman said, Mr. President Coolidge, I guarantee I can get you to say more than 4 words by the end of the night. He didn't speak the entire night, and at the end of the night, the woman and him were sitting next to each other. And as he was leaving, he turned to her and said, I win. Which I thought was, I always liked that story. He promoted business. He helped expand on Harding's promotion of industrialization, bringing America into the 20th century. But by doing so, he ignored the incoming collapse that was about to happen. 1923 to 1929. What's about to hit? So I will put him... I'll put him at D+. I'll put him with Harding. Herbert of the Hoover. Hoover worked on humanitarian efforts and public work programs. However, his entire administration, 1929 to 1933, would be the pinnacle of the Great Depression, the greatest economic tragedy that ever hit the world. Black Friday of 29? What? No. Maybe it was 32. Depression will settle off and thousands would lose millions. Pretty much the country would go into a terrible, terrible recession. Hoover, it's easy to blame Hoover being he was the man at the helm when it happened. But this was culminating after, World War One, the immense spending that the United States did following the war and the success. We were paying Germany's debts for them. And then by doing that, we set off the Depression. Pretty much, because by helping Germany pay off their debts, we then had to quickly recall our debts from Germany, which then Germany wasn't able to pay, so they defaulted. And then because they couldn't pay their debts, France, England, all these other nations also defaulted. Hoovervilles became a very famous thing. That was these shanty towns that they would name after the president. And I'm gonna have to put him at D+. I believe he also had quite a few affairs. He was actually, I heard, a very he was a very got around kind of gentleman. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt's cousin, who married his niece. He was a second or third cousin, I believe, so it's not as weird as you think it is. He was also from New York. He grew up in the Hudson Valley, whereas Theodore Roosevelt grew up in Manhattan. The Roosevelts were obviously a rich, wealthy family from New York. He would go on to pretty much bring the United States out of the Depression with the New Deal, Social Security Act. He pretty much did everything he could to help lift us out. He will be the only president, though. He served from 1933 to 1945. And 1945 was the beginning of his fourth term. So to me, that just he made the excuse the country needed him, because in 1941 the United States will enter World War II, and that's understandable, and I get that, but also now we understand why it's dangerous doing that, because he will die into his fourth term. He was a womanizer, pretty well known. He cheated on his wife Eleanor Roosevelt a lot. He also created the internment camps. That's where they locked up Japanese U.S. civilians. This wasn't like just Japanese people. These were civilians of the United States that he kind of racially profiled and said they are the ones who are, they are doing it. And obviously that wasn't true, but sadly that is part of his legacy. He will be known as progressive. He was a Democrat, the first Democrat after, if you notice, what happens a lot is there's a few Republicans since Lincoln. There's a few Republicans, then one or two Democrats, then a few Republicans, then one or two Democrats. Roosevelt will be obviously the Democrat, and I'm gonna actually put him up here with Lincoln. I think he did more good than bad. The internment camps were unforgivable, but you need to, in that scope, in World War I, they locked up Germans. So it was very similar, but, yeah. Alrighty. Harry S. Truman. Truman, the man who did not think he'd be the president. A little young guy from Missouri, I believe. He implemented the Marshall Plan, helped with the reconstruction of Europe, integrated the United States Armed Forces, which was a huge step. The United States Armed Forces had not been integrated since the 1700s, since the American Revolution. Obviously, U.S. colored troops were in most wars after that. Buffalo Soldiers of the Spanish-American War, the Harlem Hellfighters in World War I, obviously the U.S. colored troops in the American Civil War. He will finally bring an end to the the segregation. Very big steps in civil rights. He also will be responsible for the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I'll be honest, I'm gonna make him be. I will. Yes, I think that's a very hard decision to make, and I think he made the right decision. Where they were projecting millions dead on the initial attacks on mainland Japan. Oppenheimer, Einstein, all these guys came to him and said, well, we made these bombs to beat the Germans, and Truman was like, we'll use them. And he brought that war to an end. It's terrible what happened. Cities were turned to glass, but it's war. Sadly, the United States, what we did to Dresden was very similarly brutal. Speaking of war, Dwight D. Eisenhower, he will be president from 1953 to 1961. He will create the U.S. interstate. Yes, that interstate you all drive on, that was because of Eisenhower. He got the idea during his time in Europe during the Second World War. He thought the German highways were so well done, the same thing in Italy and France, and he said to himself, why do we not do this in the United States? So what they ended up doing was building these massive, massive highway systems, and you know, he reigned over reigns is not really the word I should use. He was president over a very prosperous time in American history. He also will warn about the military-industrial complex, but also he did not do a lot towards civil rights. He actually lived in Gettysburg, fun fact. He wasn't from Pennsylvania, but he had a training base there in the interwar period between World War I and World War II, where they would have tanks drive down Confederate Avenue, and he liked the town, and that's where he would go to retire. Eisenhower, I am actually going to put up B. That's right. I think he's earned it. I think he did a very good job. JFK. See, JFK is a very hard one to do. He served 2 years, pretty much, 1961 to 1963. And it's crazy because this is a period, actually, my parents were alive for him. My parents were children, but they were alive. And my grandmother told me about, what happened in November of 63 and how crazy it was. But, he helped the country. He pretty much led us through the closest we ever were to complete annihilation. The Cuban Missile Crisis could have easily destroyed the world. You would have had the Soviet Union firing nukes at the United States firing nukes at the Soviet Union, Europe firing nukes at the Soviet Union, Soviet satellites firing nukes at Europe. Everything could have escalated so quickly, but he sat there, he calmly, 13 Days, great movie. Kevin Costner's got to keep doing these historical movies. He does a really good job. But he pretty much led us through that, and it was very tough. He promoted the space race, which is probably one of his greatest achievements, and he was slowly outlining civil rights. He was a Massachusetts Democrat. He got some criticism because of a little nepotism. He placed his brother Bobby as his attorney general. Bobby would also be assassinated, I believe, 5 years later while running for president. He would be greatly criticized about the Bay of Pigs invasion. That was an attempt to have Cuban nationalists retake Cuba. He last minute pulled U.S. air and naval support, which cost the lives of hundreds of Cuban exiles who were either killed or imprisoned after the Bay of Pigs by Castro and his communist forces. Overall, not a bad president. Again, he only served 2 years, really, if you want to really boil it down. So I'm sadly going to have to put him... I'll put him at B. I'll put him at B tier. Lyndon B. Johnson, 63 to 69. He'll finish out Kennedy's term and then run for re-election and win. He will create the Great Society program and sign off on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and establish Medicare and Medicaid. He, however, will be the one who puts boots in the ground in Vietnam. Vietnam is what many consider the war we lost, and also as we enter, and again, I'm not trying to get political or anything, but as we're entering the 21st century, we're seeing how the Great Society is backfiring. The social programs entitled by the Great Society kind of backfired on people it was meant to benefit. It in a way, some say, destroyed the nuclear family. So, gonna put him... I'll put him as C because, again, he had to take over a messy situation, and he did a lot of good for civil rights. He met with MLK Jr. However, I do think the Great Society and the escalation of Vietnam were not a good idea. Dick Nixon. Richard Nixon's great-grandfather actually was at the Battle of Gettysburg, and Richard would actually be named after the man who saved his life at the Battle of Gettysburg. That's a fun fact. I actually just recently found out at Gettysburg. I knew he fought in the Civil War. I just didn't know the whole story behind his grandfather. Nixon will open diplomatic relations with China. he will also end U.S. involvement in Vietnam. However, and he's president 69 to 74, he will be kind of responsible for the rise of Pol Pot. His bombing raids of Cambodia will be what caused the Cambodians to side with Pol Pot, create one of the worst genocides that ever happened. And it would actually be the Vietnamese that go in and stop Pol Pot. But he did end the war in Vietnam for the United States. He also, though, would be responsible for the Watergate scandal. He would resign. He would be pardoned by his successor. His successor actually was not his Speaker of the House. It was not his Vice President. It was the Speaker of the House, Jerry Ford. But Nixon, we're going to put it at C-. And now, Jerry Ford. Jerry Ford is a very controversial president. He will only serve from 74 to 77, ending Nixon's second term. Ironically, Nixon spied on an election that he had already won. But, that's what happens when you're a feeble, scared man. You spy on your political opponents. But Jerry Ford will help restore public trust in the presidency after Watergate, and he'll sign a Helsinki Accord with the Soviet Union, which would start cooling down the Cold War. Him pardoning Nixon was very controversial, and the fact that he was not elected to be president, that's why he'll only serve out the end of Nixon's term. I'm going to put him at D+. He was a Republican, of course, as well. And then we got Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter actually was very influential in, talking about modern day things going on with Gaza and Israel and how the Middle East viewed the state of Israel. He was he's a very humanitarian. What's the word? He's a very good man. He's still alive to this day. He's 99 years old. God bless him, because he still does a great humanitarian work. But the issue is, because of all the social programs, the humanitarian work he was doing, inflation went up, and the country was looking like it's about to enter a recession. Under his term, he would only serve one term, and he would lose his re-election to Ronald W. Reagan. I think he's a very nice man. I'm going to put him at C, though. A C-. And that, my friends, will be my presidential tier list. So we got at the top. S tier, George Washington, Theodore Roosevelt. A tier, Abraham Lincoln, Franklin D. Roosevelt. B tier, Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, William McKinley, Dwight Eisenhower. B-, John Adams, Ulysses S. Grant, not Andrew Garfield, wow. Did I actually just forget Garfield's name? I literally just did. I literally just did. Give me one moment, friends. I'm so sorry. James Garfield. Wow, that's embarrassing. James Garfield, Harry S. Truman, John F. Kennedy. C+, Rutherford B. Hayes, Grover Cleveland. C, James Madison, James Monroe, John Quincy Adams, and Lyndon B. Johnson. C-, Martin Van Buren, James K. Polk, Chester Arthur, William Harrison, William Howard Taft, Warren Harding, Calvin Coolidge, Tricky Dick Nixon, Jimmy Carter. D+, John Tyler, Zachary Taylor, Millard Fillmore, Tyler Pierce, Woodrow Wilson, Herbert Hoover, and Jerry Ford. D, William Henry Harrison, James Buchanan, and Andrew Johnson. And then, obviously, I'm not going to discuss Ronald Reagan, George Bush, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and Joe Biden. They are too modern. We really haven't seen the effects of their programs. Even Lyndon B. Johnson, I felt very weird bringing up the Great Society, because we are seeing the ramifications of it to this day. But that is what I sincerely believe. All right, friends. Well, thank you for joining us. I didn't think this was going to be a two-part series, but in that previous episode, I did talk a lot about those presidents, and talked a fairly good amount about these presidents as well. Both these videos will be above 40 minutes, which, most of my over 40-minute videos are usually gameplays. So this is definitely a first for that. Thank you so much for joining me, friends. I hope you enjoyed the content. Again, if you disagree, it's perfectly fine. Please comment. I love the Discord. Just be respectful. That's all I ask. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you in the next one.